Hello everyone, I am here to help you today. I know you used this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Get comfortable and relax. Story 1. I'm a 27-year-old woman, and this story happened just last Thanksgiving. At the time I was living in a shared house with a few friends from college. It had been about 5 years since we all graduated, but we managed to stay close and found work in the same city. So, we decided to move in together, splitting the rent and supporting one another as we navigated the early stages of adulthood. We made it work, and our home became a space of laughter, late-night conversations, and the kind of comfort that only comes from friends who've seen you grow. Thanksgiving came, and like most people, my roommates made plans to travel home and spend the holiday with their families. I, however, did not. My relationship with my parents had always been rocky, the kind of rocky that doesn't make for warm dinners or cozy reunions. So instead of heading home, I chose to stay behind. The idea of a quiet house actually sounded nice, peaceful even. I figured I'd enjoy the solitude, maybe catch up on some reading or binge watch a new show. Besides, there was a work event that I wanted to attend, a casual get-together at a local bar where a bunch of us from the office planned to unwind before the holiday weekend. That evening I got dressed and took a cab to the bar. It was a typical office affair, loud enough to be fun but small enough to feel familiar. We shared drinks and stories, laughing at things that, in any other context, wouldn't have been that funny. After a couple of hours, I decided to call it a night. I wasn't interested in staying out late or drinking too much. Honestly, the idea of curling up with some Netflix sounded far more appealing than navigating another conversation about deadlines and holiday travel. I stepped outside and called an Uber. A car pulled up within minutes. It was a dark grey sedan, clean and quiet. I got in, sliding into the back seat. The driver was a middle-aged man, maybe in his mid-40s. He had a bald head, a neatly trimmed beard, and wore a light jacket despite the cold. His demeanor was warm, chatty, almost too friendly, but not in an obviously threatening way. I didn't really feel like talking, but when he asked me a few casual questions about my night, I answered politely. I didn't want to be rude. He asked if I had plans for Thanksgiving. I told him that my roommates had all gone home to be with family, but I stayed behind. Then he laughed, this strange, awkward kind of laugh, and said, "So, you're home alone, huh?" He turned his head slightly to look back at me as he smiled. The moment that sentence left his mouth, I felt a strange weight settle in the pit of my stomach. I had already given him my address, and now he knew I'd be alone. My instincts prickled with alarm, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe he didn't mean anything by it. Maybe it was just small talk. Still, I felt something inside me shift, a kind of caution that made me sit a little straighter and pay a little more attention. He didn't say anything else that was overtly alarming, but his silence for the rest of the ride wasn't exactly comforting either. I watched the lights of the city pass by through the window and counted down the blocks to home. When we finally pulled up in front of the house, I muttered a quick thank you, stepped out and hurried up the path to the front door. I unlocked it, stepped inside and immediately locked it behind me. Then, just to be sure, I peeked out through the front window. The car was still sitting there. For a second I froze, but then it began to move. Slowly, it drove away down the street, disappearing into the night. I exhaled and told myself I was overreacting. He had probably just been checking something on his GPS before pulling off. Still, I went to bed with a weird sense of unease. I told myself that everything was fine, that the house was locked up, that I was safe. Later that night, I was in bed watching a show on my laptop when I heard it. A sound from downstairs. A long, slow creaking, like a door being opened. My stomach dropped. I sat up, eyes wide, my heart suddenly pounding. Then came footsteps. Soft, deliberate, moving across the floor below. In that moment, I realized something. I had locked the front door, but I couldn't remember if I'd locked the back door. Panic began to rise in my chest. I quietly closed my laptop and set it aside, creeping toward my bedroom door. I stood there, listening. The footsteps were real. Someone was in the house. I pushed my dresser in front of the door as quietly as I could, but that was a mistake. The noise must have revealed where I was, because suddenly the footsteps got faster, closer. He was coming up the stairs. I backed away from the door and ran into the closet, dialing 911 on my phone with trembling hands. I whispered to the dispatcher, explaining in the smallest voice I could manage that someone was inside my home. She told me to stay quiet and stay calm. The police were on their way. 5 minutes, she said. Those 5 minutes stretched into eternity. The sound of heavy footsteps reached my bedroom door. Then came the banging. Loud, angry, insistent. The dresser groaned under the pressure as he tried to force the door open. I was frozen, holding the phone to my ear, my breath caught in my throat. "I've called the police," I finally screamed. "They're on their way." There was a moment of silence. Then mercifully the banging stopped. I waited, still holding my breath. And then, faintly, I heard them. The sirens. The sweet sound of sirens wailing in the distance, getting closer. The dispatcher whispered to me that officers were right outside. A knock came at my bedroom door. This time it was soft, followed by a calm female voice identifying herself as a police officer. I opened the door cautiously, tears already welling in my eyes. She stepped into the room and assured me I was safe. They had someone in custody. We walked outside together, and that's when I saw him. He was sitting in the back of a police car, hands cuffed, his head ducked low. It was the Uber driver. My heart felt like it had stopped. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The friendly, talkative man who had driven me home just hours ago had come back. He had waited. He had broken in. And he had come for me. I later learned that after dropping me off, he had circled back to the house. He had parked a block away and approached from the back alley. He must have checked the back door and found it unlocked. I had forgotten to secure it. That simple mistake nearly cost me everything. There were so many what-ifs that ran through my mind in the days that followed. What if I had fallen asleep early and hadn't heard him enter? What if I hadn't had my phone nearby? What if the police hadn't arrived in time? The terrifying possibilities haunted me. He was charged with trespassing, attempted burglary, and intent to commit a felony. I didn't go to the trial. I didn't want to see him again. But I stayed in touch with the detective who had helped with my case. She assured me that he was unlikely to get out anytime soon. Even now, long after the incident, the memory of that night lingers. I've moved to a different city and I no longer use ride-sharing services alone, especially at night. I double-check all the locks before bed and I keep my phone within arm's reach. I've learned that safety isn't just about the locks on your doors. It's about the choices you make, the instincts you follow, and the risks you... I never thought something like that would happen to me. It's the kind of thing you hear about on the news or in someone else's story. But it did happen. And now, whenever I'm home alone, I remember the lesson that night taught me. Never, ever tell a stranger that you're by yourself. And always, always lock the back door. Story 2. When I was growing up, my mum worked night shifts as a nurse at a retirement home. Her shift started at 6 in the evening and ran until 2 in the morning. At first, she used to hire a babysitter for me and my older brother, Andrew, but eventually, as we got a little older, we convinced her we were fine on our own. She was hesitant, but we were both responsible kids, and after a while she gave in. We loved it. Being home alone made us feel grown up, No rules, no bedtime, and best of all, no babysitter telling us we couldn't eat snacks or watch TV past 9. Neither Andrew nor I were troublemakers. We were actually pretty tame for boys our age. We'd come home, knock out our homework, then turn on the TV and spend the night watching whatever cartoons or sitcoms we could find. Our living room was at the front of the house, with a big window right next to the TV. If you sat on the couch just right, you could see the street and sidewalk out of the corner of your eye while watching television. It was one of those cozy suburban setups where nothing ever happened. Nothing exciting, nothing dangerous, just ordinary life, night after night. This night started like any other. We were sprawled out on the couch, half focused on the show playing in front of us and half scrolling through our phones. It was dark outside, the kind of quiet you only get in sleepy neighborhoods where most of the houses had lights off by 10, but there were still occasional headlights drifting by, cars either heading home or just passing through. I didn't pay them much attention until something started to feel off. I noticed that the same van kept driving past our house. At first, I didn't think much of it. People got lost sometimes. Maybe they were looking for a friend's house or missed a turn. But then it passed again, and again, and then, once more. That's when I turned the volume down and sat up a little straighter. "Hey," I nudged Andrew, "that van's come by like 4 times now." He looked at me, a little annoyed at being pulled out of the episode, but then turned his head toward the window. We waited in silence, eyes fixed on the street, and sure enough, less than a minute later, the same van rolled by slowly, its headlights brushing across the front of our house like searchlights. It was an old, dull grey minivan, probably from the late 90s, boxy and beat-up looking, like the kind of vehicle someone might use for work, or something else. The windows were tinted darker than usual, and the headlights seemed dim, like the bulbs hadn't been changed in years. It didn't stop, just kept looping around the block. But each time, it slowed just a little bit more when it reached our house. We tried to stay calm. After all, we didn't want to panic over nothing. Maybe the driver was just lost. Maybe he was waiting for someone. But we couldn't deny how strange it felt. The air in the room shifted. What had once been a regular night suddenly felt like it had a razor's edge running through it. Eventually, the van stopped driving by. We didn't see it again for nearly an hour. We breathed a little easier, convincing ourselves that whoever it was had found where they were going and left. We returned to our show, though neither of us was really watching anymore. Our ears were tuned to every little sound outside, every passing car, every flicker of shadow. It was getting late, and we both agreed it was probably time for bed. The van was parked directly in front of our house. It hadn't just driven off, it had been waiting, just out of view where we couldn't see it from the couch. I closed the curtain immediately, my heart thudding in my chest. But then, slowly, I peeled back a sliver and peeked through. There was someone sitting in the driver's seat. I couldn't make out any clear details. His face was mostly obscured by the darkness, but I saw enough to know he was watching. Not watching the street, not staring off into space, watching our house. The way he sat there, completely still, his body angled just slightly forward. It was unnatural, predatory. I called out to Andrew in a shaky voice, asking him to come back downstairs. He rushed down, concern etched on his face as soon as he saw mine. "The van's back," I whispered. "It's parked right outside." "There's someone inside." Andrew joined me at the curtain and peered out. After a few seconds, he backed away. "I think he saw me," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. We didn't know what to do. We were home alone, no adults, no protection, and now a stranger was parked outside our house in the middle of the night, staring into our windows. Fear crawled up our spines like ice water. Despite our pride in handling ourselves alone, we decided it was time to call Mum. We'd never bothered her at work before, always tried to prove we could manage without her. But this felt different. This wasn't a forgotten homework assignment or a strange noise in the attic. This felt real. Mum answered on the second ring. We explained everything, stumbling over our words, hearts pounding as we described the van, the man, the way he just sat there, unmoving. She didn't hesitate. She told us she was coming home immediately and to stay away from the windows. Her voice was calm, but I could tell she was scared. We turned off the lights in the living room and sat quietly in the hallway, trying to stay hidden. Every sound outside made us jump. A creak of the house settling, the wind brushing against the siding, even the distant bark of a dog made us flinch. The minutes dragged. Then, finally, we saw it. Our Mum's headlights turning into the driveway. I ran to the window, barely able to contain the rush of relief. But when I looked out, the van was gone. Completely vanished. No sound, no taillights. Just gone. We ran to meet her at the door, and the moment she stepped inside, we threw our arms around her. We told her that the van had been parked outside up until just before she pulled in. She nodded, her face pale, her lips pressed into a tight line. She called the police. Officers came and took our statements, but without a license plate or any identifying details, there wasn't much they could do. They patrolled the neighborhood for a while, but didn't find anything unusual. For a long time after that, the fear stayed with us. Mum hired a babysitter again, even though we were already teenagers. At first we protested, but deep down we understood. Something about that night left a mark on us. The not knowing, the what ifs. What if he had gotten out of the van? What if we had opened the door? What if Mum had taken longer to get home? Even now, years later, I sometimes think about that van. About the man who sat inside it, just watching, waiting. I wonder what he was looking for, what he wanted, why he chose our house. We never saw the van again. It was as if it vanished, along with the answers we would never get. But that night taught us a lot about fear, about intuition, and most of all, about how quickly the ordinary can turn terrifying. It taught us that danger doesn't always knock loudly. Sometimes it waits patiently in a silent van, parked just outside your window. Story 3. This happened a long time ago, so I apologize if some of the details seem foggy. I've tried to push the memory away for years, locking it in a part of my mind I hoped I'd never have to visit again. But some experiences refuse to stay buried. Some stories demand to be told, especially when the silence only gives them more power. So, I've decided it's time to share what happened to me and my brother one night when we were home alone. Looking back, I think we both knew something wasn't right the moment we heard those footsteps But at the time we were just two kids trying to enjoy a night with our parents, trying to feel safe in a world that suddenly felt anything but. It started like any normal evening. My brother Ron and I were in my bedroom, huddled in front of the television watching the NFL. It was a big game, one we had been looking forward to all week. The energy in the room was electric, filled with cheers and groans every time our team fumbled the ball or missed an easy play. We yelled at the screen like we were in the stands, our excitement bouncing off the walls of our quiet home. We were completely immersed, our eyes glued to every movement on the screen, our minds far from the world outside that bedroom door. About 40 minutes into the game, our quarterback threw a wild pass that got intercepted. Ron, frustrated, slammed his hand down on the remote, accidentally switching off the TV. The room went black for a second. I groaned, muttering, "What the hell, man?" as I reached for the remote to turn it back on. The screen flickered to life once more, but that's when we heard it. Dawn, not casual, not clumsy, deliberate, urgent. Ron and I both froze. Our eyes met, and I saw a flicker of something in his expression I hadn't seen before. Worry. Fear. I turned the volume down, heart beginning to thump louder than the game. The footsteps didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to grow louder, as if someone was pacing below us or moving from room to room. "I think someone's inside," Ron whispered, and I could hear the stutter in his voice. His bravado from moments ago was gone. I tried to reason with him, to bring logic into the room. "It's probably just the dog," I said. We had a Jack Russell Terrier who sometimes made enough noise for two people, but deep down, I didn't believe that. Not really. Ron wasn't taking any chances. He got up, crossed the room and locked the door. The click echoed louder than it should have. I realized too late that the sound might have revealed our presence and our location, but at the time, we didn't think about that. All we knew was that something was very wrong. More footsteps followed, this time slower, heavier, closer. Ron whispered again, his voice more certain now. "That's not the dog." The weight of his words hit me like a punch in the chest. I started to feel the cold claws of panic creep into my skin, but I tried to hold myself together. I knew if we both panicked, we'd lose control. Ron began rummaging through my room looking for something. Anything we could use as a weapon. A baseball bat, a lamp, even a screwdriver. I sat next to the door, pressing my ear against the wall, listening for anything, hoping to hear nothing. But the silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was charged, tense, like the air before a thunderstorm. Then I got on the floor, lying flat, and looked through the gap under the bedroom door. At first, I didn't see anything, just shadows and faint movement. But then, in the dim hallway light, I saw them. Boots, a pair of faded, dusty boots, right outside our room. The figure stood still for a moment. I couldn't see a face, couldn't tell what he was doing, but he was there, watching, listening. I pushed myself back and crawled toward Ron, who was holding his phone like a lifeline. He had one of those fingerprint locks set up, so I grabbed his hand and pressed his thumb to the screen. The phone unlocked with a loud beep that felt like a scream in the silence. We both winced. Then came the sound of footsteps again, but this time they were sprinting. Whoever it was, he had heard us. The man ran to our bedroom door, slamming into it with terrifying force. The sound was deafening. The door rattled, and the dresser we had shoved in front of it groaned under the pressure. Then came the shouting, rage-filled, inhuman screaming. He was yelling that he was going to kill us. Over and over again. Without thinking, I opened the window and climbed onto the porch roof outside. I looked back and screamed for Ron to follow me. He was in shock, frozen, his hands trembling, his face pale. I could see him trying to move, trying to force his body to cooperate. He stood, staggered to the window and climbed out beside me just as the man inside slammed against the door again. Oh, we didn't wait. We jumped off the roof. I landed hard, rolling on the grass, the jolt shooting pain up my leg. Ron landed beside me, twisting his ankle, but managing to stay upright. We didn't stop. We ran. We ran faster than we ever had before, not looking back. Block after block, our lungs burned, our hearts pounded, and our legs moved purely out of fear. Somewhere along the way, I remembered the phone in my pocket. I pulled it out and heard a faint voice, .9911, asking if we were still there. I told her we needed help, gave her our address through gasps and sobs. She told us to stay on the line. Help was on the way. Eventually we slowed down. The adrenaline wore off just enough for reality to hit us like a truck. We had left our dog behind. My eyes welled up with guilt and fear. I hadn't thought about him once during our escape, but now I couldn't stop thinking about him. Alone, scared, maybe in danger. We circled back, approaching the house cautiously, guided by the flashing red and blue lights of police cars. We watched as officers went inside. We stood on the curb, unable to move, our eyes fixed on the house. Minutes passed. Then one of the officers returned. In his arms was our dog. Alive, unharmed. I ran forward and scooped him up, holding him so tightly he whimpered. I buried my face in his fur, apologizing over and over again. But the man was gone. The police searched every corner, every closet, every room. Nothing. No signs of forced entry. Nothing missing. Not even a clue. Just a house full of terror. And two boys who no longer felt safe in the place they once called home. We installed cameras the next day. We double-checked every lock. For weeks, neither of us slept well. Every noise became a threat. Every shadow a warning. It took months to feel okay again. And even now, years later, I still lock my door at night. Not just the front door. My bedroom door too. Because I saw those boots, I heard those footsteps, and I'll never forget the sound of that voice on the other side of the door. Story 4. My name is Kyle and I live in Edmonton, Alberta. Or at least, I used to. Back when this happened, I was 17 years old. I'm 19 now, and even with 2 years of distance, the memory of that day still feels as raw and unsettling as if it had happened just yesterday. I never believed in ghosts. My family did, though. My mum and brother would tell stories, always insisting that something wasn't right with the house we lived in, but I brushed them off, calling it stress, dreams, or just plain coincidence. That skepticism died quickly one August afternoon when I found myself face to face with something I couldn't explain. Something no one should have to explain. Before I get to what happened to me, I should tell you about what my family experienced first. My mum and brother both suffered from something that, until that point, I had only read about online. Sleep paralysis. They described it in chillingly similar ways, despite never really discussing it with each other in detail until everything came to a head. Both said they'd wake up in the dead of night, unable to move, with the crushing weight of something pressing down on their chest, not metaphorically, physically, like a presence had settled atop them. They would open their eyes and feel the suffocating grip of fear, certain they weren't alone, but unable to cry out. My brother described a time when he could see shadows moving in the corners of the room, even though everything else was still. My mum would later say she felt icy breath brush against her ear while paralyzed. Both would wake up with their blankets ripped off, thrown across the room, as if some invisible force had yanked them away. It was strange, definitely. Creepy, sure, but to me it still felt like one of those shared family myths. The kind of thing people build up over time. Confirmation bias, maybe. I dismissed it as stress-induced hallucinations or dreams. I kept telling myself they just needed rest, and for a while nothing happened to me. No shadows, no whispering, no cold breath. Just the normal life in what I thought was a perfectly average house. Then came the weekend that changed everything. It was a sunny Saturday in the middle of August. My mum had taken my younger brother to his soccer practice across town, and I had the house to myself. I remember how still everything felt. The sun filtered in through the blinds, painting the walls with long streaks of gold. I was in my room, chatting with a buddy on Discord while we played some multiplayer games. We laughed, yelled, and cursed as we died and respawned again and again, like any other normal day. After a couple of hours, my friend logged off. I closed the game, shut down my PC, and flopped back on my bed with a satisfied sigh. I picked up my phone and opened YouTube, intending to watch a few videos before grabbing a snack. As I lay there, my legs draped off the edge of the bed, I heard something that stopped me mid-scroll. It came from the kitchen. The first sound was subtle, dishes in the sink rattling, just a little clinking. At first I thought it might have been the wind shaking the windows, or maybe the dryer tumbling. I sat up, frowning, and listened closer. Then I heard it again. Clearer this time. The creak of cabinet doors opening and shutting. A few times, soft but deliberate. I paused the video and sat perfectly still. No one was supposed to be home. I was absolutely certain of that. I checked my phone again. My mum had sent a text saying they wouldn't be back until after 4 p.m. It was barely 2:30. There was no way it was them. Still, I tried to rationalize. Maybe they came home early. Maybe someone forgot something and came back. I slid off my bed, moved quietly toward the hallway and peered down it. The house was still. Too still. The kind of stillness that feels like it's holding its breath. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just outside the kitchen entrance, stood what I can only describe as a shadow in human form. It wasn't like the darkened silhouette of a person standing in the light. This thing didn't have depth or features. It was black mist, smoke in the vague shape of a man, and it wasn't moving. It didn't sway or twitch or flicker. It just stood there, watching. Though it had no eyes, I could feel it watching. My body froze. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. I stared, and for a moment time seemed to collapse. The edges of my vision dimmed, and all I could hear was the wild thudding of my heart. I blinked. It was still there. The black, misty form, dot silent and still, like it was waiting for something. I stumbled backward and slammed my door shut. That finally broke the trance. Panic took over, and I pressed my body against the door, bracing it like a kid from a horror movie. I knew deep in my bones that if that thing decided to come down the hall, nothing I did would stop it. My phone was still on my bed, glowing with the paused video thumbnail. I dove for it, fingers fumbling across the screen as I texted my mum. "There's something in the house. What do I do?" She replied almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting for a message like that. "Get out. Don't stay. Go to a friend's house now." I peeked out through the narrow gap between the door and the hallway. The figure was gone. Not eased away, not faded. Just gone. I didn't wait for a second sign. I grabbed my longboard, shoved my shoes under one arm and bolted down the hall. I ran out the front door, slamming it behind me, and didn't stop until I reached the end of our driveway. My hands shook as I slipped on my shoes, and then I pushed off, riding like a madman toward my friend's house. The same friend I'd been gaming with earlier. When I got there, I was still breathless, half hysterical. I didn't need to explain much. He opened the door and saw my face, and that was enough. I told him everything. describing the shadow figure in the hallway and the sounds in the kitchen. His face paled as he listened. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "That sounds like what I saw at your house once." I blinked. "What?" He told me that a few months ago he had slept over. At some point during the night he woke up and saw something in the kitchen. A figure, a dark one. It had been standing still, facing the hallway, just like I described. He thought he was dreaming. He was half asleep and didn't want to sound crazy, so he never mentioned it. Until now. We sat there in silence for a long time, both trying to process what we had seen. I texted my mum again, and once she got home we returned together. Walking through that front door again felt like entering a haunted museum. Nothing looked out of place, but everything felt wrong. The kitchen was in disarray. The dishes in the sink had been moved, some shifted to the counter. The cabinet doors hung open like mouths mid-scream. We didn't sleep there that night. Instead, we packed bags and stayed with my cousins in Sherwood Park, about 15 minutes away. It wasn't until the next day that we returned. The house felt normal again, like nothing had ever happened, except all the lights were on, every single one. From that moment forward, I stopped dismissing my family's experiences. I stopped calling their stories exaggerations. I stopped pretending that we lived in a normal house. Because we didn't. We lived in a place where shadows moved on their own, where things whispered in the silence, where unseen hands pulled blankets from sleeping bodies and watched from doorways. I don't know what it was that stood in my hallway that day. I don't know what it wanted, but I know it was real. And now, I believe. Story 5. It had been a fairly uneventful stretch of summer, one of those seasons where the days just bleed into one another with the consistency of boredom and the comfort of routine. My best friend had been staying over at my house pretty frequently. Nothing unusual about that. We were both about 16 and had known each other since kindergarten, practically inseparable by that point. Every time he visited, we would end up venturing into the woods that bordered my backyard. These weren't the kinds of woods that stretch for miles or hold old legends. They were just thick enough to get lost in for a few hours, with trails carved out by kids on bikes and squirrels darting through the underbrush. Most days we'd go there with no real agenda, just to walk around, toss rocks into creeks, snap sticks under our feet, and talk about whatever was on our minds. It was nothing more than a bit of harmless fun, and gave us a break from our phones and game consoles. But this day was different. Even before we stepped into the woods, there was something subtly wrong about the way the air felt. It was thick, almost humid, but without the heat you'd expect. The sky was clear, but the light filtering through the trees had a strange greyish tinge to it. Not quite stormy, not quite overcast, just off. And we stumbled across a few strange things on our walk, odd little remnants that made no real sense. There was a crushed Mountain Dew can, clearly ancient, its label nearly faded to white, the aluminium covered in a patchwork of rust. Next to it, half buried in leaves, we found a toy boat, the kind a kid might have floated in a puddle. It was rotted, its plastic hull cracked and warped by time and weather, moss growing in its crevices like a miniature reef. These things weren't terrifying by themselves, but something about them felt like pieces of a story we didn't want to finish, like evidence of a forgotten memory, or maybe a warning left by someone who never made it back out. We kept going, and eventually we came upon something I had seen once before, a natural bridge made of a fallen tree that stretched over a narrow river running through the woods. The last time I'd come this far, it had just been a landmark, something cool to look at, maybe cross for a bit of a thrill. But this time the tree wasn't empty. Sitting on top of it, perched right at the center like it had been placed there deliberately, was a deer skull, pure white, picked clean and gleaming in the odd light. There was no flesh, no blood, just bone and empty eye sockets staring at nothing. I didn't know what to make of it. I could feel the silence around us deepening, like the forest itself was holding its breath. My friend stared at the skull for a long time without saying anything. Then he turned, looking past the river, and pointed silently. On the far side, rising behind a tangle of trees and brambles, was a hill I had never noticed before. At the top of that hill sat a house. A small one, weather-beaten and barely visible through the foliage. The kind of place you don't build in a forest, but maybe get left behind by someone who wanted to disappear. We stood there for a long time, not crossing the tree bridge, not going any closer. That's when we heard the sound. It was faint at first, high-pitched and creaking, like an old wooden floorboard or the hinge of a door swaying in the breeze. But the forest wasn't moving. The leaves were still. There was no wind. We froze. I reached out and grabbed my friend's arm, and I could feel the tension in his muscles, his body rigid as stone. The creaking continued, rising in tone just slightly, but too rhythmic to be natural, too deliberate to be imagined. Then we heard a second noise. Footsteps. Not ours. Not animals. Footsteps, soft but heavy, moving across the forest floor on the other side of the river. They were steady, paced like someone walking with purpose but trying not to be heard. My friend turned to me with wide eyes, and before either of us could say a word, we ran. We didn't care about the path. We didn't care about making noise. We just ran, stumbling through branches, jumping over roots, our feet slamming into the ground with all the force we could muster. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know what or who was behind us. We didn't stop running until the trees thinned and we burst out of the forest and into the edge of my backyard. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. When we got back to the house, gasping for breath and soaked in sweat, we noticed the garage door was open. Neither of us remembered leaving it that way. We were almost certain it had been closed. My friend suggested maybe we'd left it open when we left, but neither of us believed it. Something was wrong, very wrong. We bolted inside and locked the door behind us, double-checking every window, every latch. I went upstairs to check the bedrooms, while my friend stayed downstairs to watch the front door. There was nothing out of place, no signs of forced entry, but the house felt violated somehow, like it had been brushed by something unnatural, like something from the forest had followed us home. We stayed in the house for hours, checking and rechecking every room, every door. My friend called his parents, but they weren't answering. Mine were out of town for the weekend. We were alone, truly terrifyingly alone. As the night wore on, the fear didn't fade. It thickened. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside the windows sounded like footsteps. Like someone testing the perimeter, like someone or something waiting. Eventually we barricaded ourselves in the living room. We turned on the TV, trying to drown out the silence with noise, but nothing worked. We didn't sleep. We didn't speak much either. Just stared at the door, then at the window, then back at each other, waiting, listening. I still don't know what was in the woods that day. I don't know what made the creaking sound or what walked through the trees with those heavy footsteps. I don't know why someone would leave a deer skull perched on a natural bridge, or why there was a house hidden at the top of a hill in the forest. I don't even know if that house is still there. Part of me never wants to find out, because whatever it was, it felt old, it felt wrong, and most of all, it felt like it didn't want to be seen. Even now, years later, I can still hear that creaking sound when I close my eyes. I can still see the empty sockets of that deer skull staring back at me from the tree bridge. I never went back into those woods. Neither did my friend. We stopped going over to each other's houses altogether after that. Not out of anger or fear of each other, but because we both understood something had shifted that day. Some line had been crossed. Some door had been opened. And some things, once seen, can never be unseen. Story 6. It was the middle of winter in upstate New York, and everything outside our house looked like a postcard. Thick layers of white snow blanketed the lawn, weighed down the trees, and muffled the world with that strange, almost sacred silence that only comes after a heavy snowfall. I was 16 at the time, and my parents had decided to take a weekend trip out of town for their anniversary, leaving me in charge of the house. It wasn't the first time. I was the responsible type, the kind of teenager teachers trusted and neighbors waved to, so no one batted an eye when I told them I'd be staying home alone. It felt like a little vacation of my own. 2 days of freedom. The entire house to myself, no chores, no curfews, just me and the quiet. I had it all planned out. I'd order a pizza, watch a few movies, maybe play some games, and sleep in without anyone waking me up. That first night started exactly as I'd imagined. Simple, peaceful, perfect. I remember the way the evening light faded, turning the snow outside a soft blue as the sun dipped below the horizon. I was in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the carpet in front of the TV, eating reheated pizza and scrolling through Netflix, trying to decide whether to start a new series or rewatch something familiar. I finally settled on a horror movie, but not because I wanted to be scared, but because the thought of watching it alone made me feel brave. I turned the lights off, wrapped myself in a fleece blanket, and pressed play. It wasn't long into the movie when I first noticed it, the feeling that something was watching me. I know how that sounds. It's easy to blame it on the movie, on nerves, on shadows playing tricks. But this was different. I paused the film and looked around. The room was empty. The only light came from the TV screen, flickering gently across the walls and furniture. I laughed at myself, shook my head and pressed play again. I told myself it was just the atmosphere of the film getting under my skin, nothing more. About an hour passed. The pizza was gone, the soda was warm, and the movie had just reached its climactic scene. That's when I heard it. A soft tap, like the click of fingernails against glass. It was so faint, I almost convinced myself I imagined it. I muted the TV and listened, heart already beginning to quicken. There it was again. Tap, tap. 2 quick, deliberate knocks, coming from the back of the house. I stood slowly, pulling the blanket tighter around me, and tiptoed toward the kitchen. Our house had a large sliding glass door that led to the backyard. During summer months, it was the door we left open to let the breeze in, the one we used for barbecues and tossing a frisbee with the dog. But tonight it was just a dark portal leading into a snow-covered yard, framed by curtains that weren't fully closed. My breath caught in my throat as I approached. I had to know what made that sound. I reached out and tugged the curtain aside just a little, just enough to peek through. And I saw him. There was a man standing on the other side of the glass, a tall man wearing a long black coat, his shoulders dusted with snow. He wasn't knocking anymore. He was just standing there, completely still, his head tilted slightly to one side like he was studying me. His face was pale and expressionless, eyes dark and unblinking. For a moment, I couldn't move. I just stood there, my fingers still holding the edge of the curtain, my body frozen with disbelief. We stared at each other, separated by nothing but a thin pane of glass and the infinite weight of that silence. Then he smiled. Not a warm smile, not the kind that says, "I'm lost," or "sorry to bother you." It was slow and deliberate, like the curling of a dead leaf in the cold. My stomach dropped. I let the curtain fall and stumbled back into the kitchen, nearly tripping over a stool. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained that a man was standing at my back door, staring at me. The dispatcher was calm, told me to stay on the line, to lock all the doors, and to stay somewhere safe until the police arrived. I did exactly that. I made sure every door and window in the house was locked. I turned off all the lights and went upstairs to my bedroom, where I could look out over the backyard without being seen. I pulled the blinds just slightly aside and looked down. He was gone. The yard was empty, the snow undisturbed, except for a single trail of footprints that led away from the sliding glass door and disappeared into the woods behind our house. My mind raced. Why didn't he knock again? Why didn't he try to break in? Why was he just watching? The police arrived within 15 minutes. They searched the area, followed the footprints as far as they could before the trail got lost in the trees. They didn't find anyone. No break-ins were reported. They took my statement and promised to patrol the neighborhood more frequently for the next few nights. I thanked them, trying to mask how shaken I felt. When they left, I rechecked every lock, turned every light on, and curled up on the couch, too scared to even close my eyes. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the house made me flinch. Every gust of wind against the window sounded like a whisper. I kept thinking about the way he looked at me, the way he smiled, like he knew something I didn't, like I was part of some game he had played before. When my parents returned the next day, I didn't tell them everything. I said someone had been outside, but I left out the part about the man's face, his smile, the way he stood so still, like a statue carved from cold intentions. I didn't want them to worry, and part of me still hoped it had all been some weird, isolated event, but it wasn't. Over the next few weeks, I started seeing things. Not clearly, not directly, just glimpses. A dark figure across the street at night, a shape moving past the window just outside the glow of the porch light. Once, while I was walking the dog, I saw someone standing at the far end of the block, half shrouded by the trees, not moving, just watching. I stopped staying home alone after that. If my parents went out, I went with them. If I had to be by myself, I made sure every curtain was closed, every door double locked, and my phone fully charged. Eventually, the sightings stopped, or maybe I just stopped looking. But the fear never really left. It's been years since that winter night. We've moved since then, relocated to a different part of town, a nicer neighborhood, a busier one. I try not to think about it anymore. I tell myself it was just a one-time thing, a stranger passing through, a man with no real intent to harm. But sometimes, in the stillness of a snowy night, when the wind rattles the windows and the world goes quiet, I remember his face, the way he smiled at me through the glass, the way he didn't knock to come in, the way he just stood there, waiting. And I wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't looked out when I did. Story 7. It's strange how the most terrifying stories begin with the most ordinary circumstances. That was certainly true for me. I wasn't doing anything unusual the day it happened. No haunted houses, no Ouija boards, no urban exploring. It was just a typical Tuesday early autumn, when the air begins to cool but hasn't quite committed to winter. I was home alone, and my parents had gone to visit family in a neighboring city, leaving me with the house for 3 full days. That might sound like freedom to most teenagers, and for a while it felt like it. I was 17, independent enough to manage myself and confident enough to enjoy the solitude. I had no parties planned, no mischief in mind. Just a quiet house, a well-stocked fridge, and a few days of undisturbed peace. Our house was old, built sometime in the 1930s. It creaked at night and groaned during storms, but it had character. Growing up there meant growing used to its quirks. The way the hallway light flickered, the way the plumbing moaned when the water ran too hot, and most notably, the unfinished basement that always seemed colder than it should have been, even in the heart of summer. My parents used it mostly for storage. Old boxes, dusty furniture, seasonal decorations, that sort of thing. We rarely had a reason to go down there. The main living spaces were upstairs, and the basement existed more like a forgotten afterthought than an active part of the house. That's what makes what happened so disturbing. Because something that was meant to be out of sight, out of mind, something that had sat silently beneath our feet for years, decided it no longer wanted to be ignored. It started with a sound, not a loud one, not at first. It was subtle, like the soft clatter of something falling over. I was upstairs in my room, reading when I heard it, this faint metallic clink, followed by a low thud. I paused and listened, but when it didn't repeat, I shrugged it off. Houses make noises. I went back to my book. About 15 minutes later, it happened again. Louder this time, something shifting, dragging, almost like a box being pushed across the cement floor. This time, I put the book down and got up. The sound had come from directly beneath my room, which meant it had to be the basement. I hesitated at the top of the stairs. I remember vividly how still the house felt in that moment. How quiet. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the old wall clock. I walked slowly down the main hallway to the basement door. It was a simple wooden door, painted white, with an old brass knob that stuck a little when you turned it. I put my hand on the knob and paused. I wasn't scared yet, not really, but I had that prickling feeling on the back of my neck that said something wasn't right. I turned the knob and opened the door. The stairs stretched downward into darkness. There was a light switch just inside the frame and I flipped it on. A dim yellow bulb flickered to life at the base of the stairs, casting weak light onto the concrete floor. I stepped down slowly, each creak of the old wooden steps loud in the silence. When I reached the bottom, I looked around. Everything was exactly as I remembered. Boxes stacked in the corners, a few old chairs, nothing seemed out of place. I was about to head back upstairs when I noticed something strange. There was a door. Not the door I had just come through. This one was in the far wall, half hidden behind an old armoire we'd never used. I stared at it, heart beginning to race. I had lived in that house for 17 years and had never seen that door. It wasn't just something I had forgotten, it was new, or at least newly revealed. The armoire must have shifted at some point, exposing it. That had to be the sound I heard earlier, but the question remained, why was there a door I didn't know about in my own house? I moved cautiously toward it. The door was short, maybe 5 feet tall, with chipped paint and no visible handle, just a keyhole. I crouched down to inspect it. The keyhole was old-fashioned, the kind you'd see in antique furniture. large enough to peer through. I leaned in and placed my eye against the hole. I wish I hadn't. At first I saw nothing, just darkness. Then, slowly, something moved in the blackness. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was a shape, a vague shifting silhouette, like someone pacing just beyond the threshold of sight. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, and nearly fell over a stack of boxes. I didn't know what I had seen, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out of the basement. I turned and bolted up the stairs, slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. For the rest of the day, I avoided that part of the house. I kept every light on. I tried watching movies, reading, anything to distract myself. But I couldn't shake the image of that hidden door, of the thing that moved in the dark behind it. Night fell, and with it came a growing sense of unease. The house, which had always felt familiar and safe, now felt foreign, like I didn't really know it, like it had been keeping secrets from me. Around 2 a.m. I was still awake, lying in bed with the blankets pulled up to my chin, when I heard it again, that dragging sound. This time, it wasn't coming from the basement. It was in the hallway. I sat up slowly, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound grew louder, closer. It was a soft, shuffling drag, like something pulling itself along the floor. My bedroom door was closed, but I could see the faintest shadow moving beneath it, blocking the light from the hallway in slow, rhythmic pulses. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Whatever was out there stopped just outside my door, and then it knocked. 3 slow knocks. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was dry, my body frozen. The knocking stopped, and for a long time there was only silence. Then, very faintly, I heard the basement door open. The next morning, I found muddy smears on the floor leading from the basement stairs to my bedroom door. Not footprints, just long, dragging smears, like something wet and heavy had been pulled through the house. The basement door, which I had locked, was wide open. The light was still on, flickering slightly. I didn't go back down there. I packed a bag, left the house, and stayed with a friend until my parents returned. When I told them what happened, they didn't believe me. They said I must have had a nightmare, that I imagined the door. But I took them down to the basement, pulled the armoire aside, and the wall was solid. No door, no keyhole, nothing. But I know what I saw, and some nights, when I lie in bed and the house creaks and groans, I swear I hear it again. The dragging, the knock, the whisper of something that doesn't belong in the world above. And I wonder if the basement ever really let it go. Story 8. There's something uniquely unsettling about living in a house surrounded by open land. To most people it sounds like peace. Wide skies, quiet nights, stars so bright they almost hum. And to be fair, it was peaceful, at least most of the time. But when you live on the edge of nothing, you start to notice that nothing can look back. That stillness can become eyes. That isolation can turn on you. Our family moved to the country when I was 14. My parents had grown tired of city life, of the traffic and sirens and cramped apartment walls. They found a small farmhouse out in the middle of the rural Midwest, surrounded by overgrown fields and a tree line that stretched like a wall between us and the world. The house was old, but charming, with creaky wooden floors and a wraparound porch that faced miles of waving grass. There were no neighbors for nearly a mile in any direction, no cars passing by, no voices after dark, just us and the land. My parents loved it. My younger sister adjusted quickly, but for me the silence was too much. I had grown up on the constant noise of city life. I liked hearing other people in the background, even if I didn't talk to them. Out here the silence was so complete, it felt alive. The first few months I slept with headphones in. I told myself it was just a phase, just a matter of adjusting, but something about the land itself gave me chills I couldn't explain. It began in small ways. Lights in the house would flicker when the wind wasn't blowing. Our dog would bark at the back door in the middle of the night, growling low with his fur bristled, refusing to go outside, no matter how much my dad called him. But it wasn't until I was left alone for the first time that things escalated into something I still can't explain. It was early fall, a Friday afternoon. My parents had gone into town for the weekend to visit friends, and my sister had gone to a sleepover. I had the house to myself, which didn't bother me at first. I liked being alone. I planned to spend the evening eating snacks, watching movies and playing video games until I passed out on the couch. It was overcast that day, the kind of heavy grey that doesn't rain but settles over everything like a wet cloth. The wind was still. The house was quiet. I remember sitting in the living room as dusk began to fall, the soft orange glow of the setting sun turning the fields gold through the windows. I paused my movie to go to the kitchen and grab a drink. That's when I first saw it. Outside, standing in the middle of the field behind our house, was a man. He was far enough away that I couldn't see his face, but close enough that I knew he was staring straight at the house, at me. He stood unnaturally still. No tools, no gear, no explanation. Just a man in dark clothes, facing our home from the waist-high grass. My heart skipped. I blinked, looked again. He was still there, unmoving, silent. I stood frozen for a moment, then backed away from the window. Every instinct screamed at me that something was wrong. I tried to rationalize. Maybe he was a farmer from down the road. Maybe he got lost or was looking for something. But the longer I stared, the less that made sense. He wasn't scanning the area. He wasn't calling out. He wasn't moving. He was just watching. I called my dad. He didn't pick up. Neither did my mum. I tried to call the house where my sister was staying, but there was no answer there either. I considered calling the police, but what would I even say? That there was a guy standing in a field? It didn't seem like much of an emergency, and yet it felt like the beginning of one. I locked every door and window in the house. Then I turned off all the lights and crouched in the living room, peeking through the curtain. The man hadn't moved. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. The light outside dimmed until it was nearly night, and he was still there. And then, without warning, he stepped forward, not rushed, not charging, just a slow, steady walk, like he had all the time in the world. I couldn't breathe. My mouth went dry. I backed away from the window and crept into the hallway, eyes glued to the back door. He didn't stop. I heard the crunch of grass underfoot, soft at first, then louder. I didn't wait any longer. I grabbed a kitchen knife, locked myself in the upstairs bathroom, and sat in the bathtub with my back against the wall, phone clutched in my hand. I dialed 911. The operator picked up immediately. I told her everything, voice trembling, trying to explain that a man was walking toward my house, that I was alone, that I didn't know who he was. She told me to stay calm, that officers were being dispatched, but it would take time. Our house was too far out, I'd have to wait. I sat there, in that cold porcelain tub, listening to every sound in the house, the creak of the floorboards, the whistle of the wind against the window. Then, footsteps on the porch, slow, measured. as if someone were deliberately placing each step with care. I held my breath. The bathroom had no windows, but I could hear everything through the vent. The front door didn't open, but something pressed against it. I heard it, a soft scraping noise, like fingers trailing across the wood. It lasted for what felt like forever. Then, silence. No knock, no call, just silence. I stayed in that bathtub for over an hour until I finally heard the distant sound of a car approaching. I peeked through the bathroom door and crept to the upstairs window. A police cruiser pulled into our long gravel driveway. I ran downstairs and flung open the front door before they even knocked. There was no sign of the man. The officers walked the property. They checked the fields, the edges of the woods, but they found nothing. No tracks, no footprints, no sign anyone had been there. One of them told me it was probably just a prank, a local messing around, but they offered to keep an eye on the area for the rest of the night. I thanked them and watched them drive away, still trembling. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window until sunrise, staring at the field. He didn't come back. But sometimes, when the sun begins to set and the light turns gold, I still look out across that open land and wonder if he's out there, watching, waiting. Because once you've seen someone who shouldn't be there, someone standing perfectly still in the middle of nowhere, looking directly at you, you don't forget. Not ever. Story 9. It happened during a period in my life when everything seemed to be slowing down. I was 20 years old, fresh out of community college, living at home again with my mum. She worked long hours as a nurse and often picked up extra shifts to help pay the bills. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and our little 2-bedroom rental on the edge of town was peaceful. Simple, the kind of place where neighbours waved, dogs barked occasionally, and the nights were filled with the familiar hush of distant traffic and the occasional owl. The house itself was nothing special, just an older single-story unit with squeaky floors and walls thin enough to hear conversations from the next room, but it had a charm to it. My room, which used to be the guest bedroom, was the smaller of the two. A modest twin bed against the wall, a thrifted desk near the window, and a sliding closet door that never seemed to close properly. I never really thought much about the closet. It was mostly storage to old shoes, jackets, boxes of school papers and photo albums. Things that didn't really have a home but couldn't be thrown out either. The closet door always seemed a bit off track, and the latch had long since broken, so it would constantly drift open just slightly, usually about an inch or two, unless I propped something in front of it. I got used to it. Everyone who's lived in an older house knows that some things just don't work right, and you learn to live around them. At first, it was just a minor inconvenience, but over time I started to notice something different about that closet. It wasn't the door itself that bothered me. It was the way it seemed to be open wider. Every time I looked at it, I would close it at night before going to bed, sliding it carefully along the worn tracks, pushing it until it clicked into place with that familiar reluctant thunk. But in the morning, it would be ajar again, just slightly, just enough to notice. I assumed it was gravity, the way the house tilted ever so slightly, or perhaps air pressure from the windows. I even tried wedging a small chair in front of it, but still, it would shift open during the night. And that wasn't all. I began to have strange dreams. At first, they were vague, just unsettling sensations of being watched or followed, of walking down endless dark hallways. But as the weeks passed, they grew more vivid. In the dreams, I would be lying in my bed, exactly as I was in real life, but unable to move. The room around me would be silent, frozen. The only thing moving was the closet door, sliding open slowly, creaking against the tracks. In the dream, I would try to scream, but no sound would come out. I could only watch as a dark shape began to emerge from the closet, crawling on all fours. Not a monster, not an animal, just a figure, human-like in form, but wrong in every way that matters. The first few times, I chalked it up to stress. I wasn't sleeping well, I was unemployed, my life felt like it was in limbo. It made sense that my mind was acting out, but then the dreams began to bleed into waking life. I started hearing faint noises at night, not from outside, not inside, in my room, scraping sounds, soft footsteps on the carpet, the whisper of fabric brushing against fabric. I would turn on the light and find nothing, of course, but the closet door would always be slightly more open than it had been before. One night, I decided to set up my phone and record a time-lapse video while I slept. I figured I'd catch the door shifting open, maybe prove to myself it was just natural settling or airflow. I placed my phone across the room, angled it toward the closet and hit record. Then I climbed into bed, heart thudding a little harder than I wanted to admit, and eventually drifted off. In the morning I reviewed the footage. For the first few hours nothing happened. I saw myself tossing and turning, the door unmoving. Then, around 3:13 a.m., the door began to slide, not all at once, slowly, gradually. It took nearly 30 minutes for it to open more than 6 inches, but that wasn't the worst part. At 3:47 a.m., something moved inside the closet. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a shadow shifting, a darker patch against the darkness, like something repositioning itself just behind the door frame. It didn't emerge, it didn't show its face, it just moved, as if aware of the camera, as if watching. I deleted the video. That same day I called my mum at work and asked if I could borrow some money to buy a new lock for the closet. She laughed it off, not out of cruelty, but because she thought I was joking. She told me to stop watching horror movies and get more sunlight. I didn't argue. But that night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up with every light on, sitting in bed with my back against the wall, eyes fixed on the closet. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe nothing. Maybe just proof that my imagination was running wild. But something did happen. Around 3:30 a.m., the closet door began to creak. Not slide, creak. Like the sound of old wood grinding against itself. It moved in tiny increments, as though someone inside was testing it, gently pushing it open. I held my breath. My body went cold. I didn't move. I couldn't. The door opened just enough for darkness to spill out. Thicker than the rest of the room, like ink leaking into water. Then something whispered my name. Not loudly, not angrily, just softly, like a suggestion, like a secret. Kyle. I leapt out of bed and flipped on every light in the room. I slammed the closet door shut and shoved the desk in front of it. Then I packed a bag and left the house. I didn't care that it was almost 4 in the morning. I didn't care that I had nowhere to go. I just needed to be somewhere else. Anywhere else. I stayed with a friend for 3 days. When I finally returned home, my mum asked me what had happened. I told her everything. I expected her to laugh again, but she didn't. Her face went pale. Then she told me something I'll never forget. When I was a baby, she had used that room as a nursery, and she had seen things, heard things, back then too. Toys that moved on their own, lights that flickered, shadows in the mirror that didn't match the room. She thought it had stopped once we moved the nursery to the larger bedroom. She thought whatever it was had gone dormant, but I had woken it up. We didn't stay in that house much longer. A few months later we moved to a newer home closer to her job. The new house is bright, clean and ordinary in every way. I haven't had any strange dreams since. But I still think about that closet. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't listened to my instincts, if I had let the door open fully, if I had answered when it whispered my name. Because some doors don't just hide things, they wait. Story 10. I was 18 when I took a job as a part-time house sitter for a family friend named Ellen. She was a kind woman in her late 60s who travelled often after retirement, sometimes for weeks at a time. Her house sat on the edge of town, a charming old colonial home built long before the rest of the neighbourhood had sprouted up around it. She'd lived there alone for nearly 20 years, ever since her husband passed, and she treated it like a museum. Carefully dusted antiques, floral wallpaper, glass cabinets filled with porcelain dolls, and thick velvet drapes that always remained drawn after sunset. The house was beautiful, in that quietly unsettling way some old homes are, like time had paused inside its walls. Ellen offered me the job because I was responsible, quiet, and didn't ask many questions. She trusted me with her keys, her plants, her mail, and most importantly, her house. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I preferred it. My own home was often chaotic, and the chance to be alone, even in a strange house, felt like a break. I'd sit on the old love seat in the parlour and read for hours, or watch the dust dance through the rays of afternoon sunlight pouring through the bay window. There was peace in that house, or so I thought. My first few shifts were uneventful. Feed the cat, water the plants, check the windows, bring in the mail and sleep in the guest room upstairs. But during my third stay, when Ellen left for a 10-day cruise, I began to notice small things that made the house feel different. It started with footsteps. Not loud, not stomping, just the faintest creak of weight shifting on old wooden floorboards. At first, I thought it was the house settling, the usual groans and moans of aged wood under shifting temperatures. But it always happened around the same time, just after midnight. The house had a wide staircase at the front, its steps covered in faded runner rugs that muted footfalls, but not completely. The first night I heard the sound, I was lying in bed in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, trying to fall asleep. That's when the creaking began. One step, then another, then a pause. I held my breath and listened. Another step. The sound was faint, as if someone was deliberately trying not to be heard, but the rhythm was unmistakable. It wasn't wind, it wasn't settling, it was movement, measured and slow, as though someone was ascending the stairs one deliberate footstep at a time. I convinced myself it was my imagination. I hadn't locked the front door right away, maybe a draft was shifting the frame. But the sound stayed with me. It wasn't a one-time occurrence. The second night, it returned. Same time. Same slow rhythm. This time I crept to the door and opened it a crack, just enough to peer out into the hallway. I saw nothing, but the sound was clearer, echoing from the bottom of the staircase and rising. I couldn't bring myself to investigate. I shut the door, locked it, and stayed under the covers until morning. On the fourth day I found something that chilled me deeper than the sounds ever could. I was dusting the sitting room, wiping down the shelves of porcelain dolls that lined the far wall. Ellen had always been proud of her collection. Each one was named, labelled with a tiny handwritten tag beneath the display case. As I worked my way down the line, I noticed one doll that didn't belong. It had no label, no stand, and looked significantly older than the others. Its eyes were glass like the rest, but there was something uncanny about their clarity, like they weren't painted, but watching. I reached to move it and felt a shock of cold shoot through my fingers. Not a static shock, not from nerves. Cold, as though I had touched something pulled from a freezer. I jerked my hand back and stared. The room seemed darker now, even though the sun still streamed through the windows. I decided to leave that doll alone. That night, the sounds on the stairs returned. Only this time, they didn't stop. The creaking reached the top of the stairs. Then came the soft sound of fabric brushing against the hallway walls, like a long dress or skirt trailing behind someone as they walked. The footsteps moved past my door, slow and unhurried. I sat frozen, eyes wide in the dark, the covers clenched in my fists. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I listened. They paused outside my door. I could hear the whisper of breathing on the other side, not ragged, not gasping, just the faint exhale of someone standing still. Then, slowly, the doorknob turned. It jiggled once, twice, then stopped. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I checked the hallway. No one was there. The house was still. But on the floor just outside my door lay a single thread of fabric. Black, frayed, and unfamiliar. I picked it up and held it in my hand. It was heavier than I expected, like it had soaked in something. I dropped it and backed away. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, that maybe the doll had unsettled me, that maybe I'd been dreaming. But as the days went on, the activity grew more intense. The lights in the hallway would flicker whenever I approached the stairs. Doors that had been closed would swing open on their own. The air inside the house grew colder each night, despite the thermostat being set. And always those footsteps on the stairs, never running, always walking. On the 6th night, I decided I couldn't sleep upstairs anymore. I brought blankets and a pillow down to the sitting room and set up a makeshift bed on the loveseat. I felt safer there, with the front door nearby and a view of both the staircase and the hallway. I turned on the small lamp beside the couch and lay down, heart still pounding, mind racing. I must have drifted off at some point, because I awoke to the sound of that same creaking, only now it was descending the stairs. My eyes snapped open. I turned my head slowly, and there, standing halfway down the stairs, was a woman. She wore a black dress that trailed behind her like smoke. Her hair was long and grey, and her face was pale, so pale it almost glowed. Her eyes, though, her eyes were the worst part. They were wide, unblinking, and looked onto mine the second I moved. She didn't speak, she didn't scream. She simply watched me. I couldn't move. She descended the rest of the stairs, one step at a time, until she stood at the bottom. The lamp flickered beside me, casting shadows that danced across the walls like flames. She took a single step forward, then another. Each one deliberate, each one slow. Her mouth never moved. Her arms hung by her sides. She kept walking toward me, and then, as suddenly as it had started, she vanished. One moment she was 2 feet from me, the next, there was nothing but air. I screamed. I didn't care how loud I was. I grabbed my phone, my keys, and ran out of the house barefoot. I drove home in tears, called Ellen and told her I couldn't stay in her house anymore. I expected her to be angry, but instead she was silent. Then she said something I'll never forget. I was hoping she'd stopped. I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't want to know. She never spoke of it again. I never went back to that house. But sometimes, in dreams, I see the stairs again, and she's always waiting, halfway down,